Hey, greetings. I'm Judd Laurie, a member of the Elders for Climate Justice. We are a group of elders within the Mankind Project of New England. Today, we're interviewing Deb Markowitz, a well-known figure in Vermont state government, especially on matters related to climate change. In addition to being elected as Secretary of State 6 terms, she was later appointed as Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources for 3 terms by our previous governor. That was from 2011 to 2017. She's currently serving as the Director of Policy Outreach, at the University of Vermont's Gund Institute of Environment. And she is also a visiting professor of Environmental Policy and Leadership at the University of Vermont's Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. Deb was educated at Harvard University's Kennedy School at its program for senior executives in state and local government. She received a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center, where she graduated magna cum laude. Her bachelor's degree was from the University of Vermont, where she majored in philosophy and political science and graduated with honors. So welcome, Deb, and many thanks for agreeing to talk with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So joining us in the interview will be 4 other members of the Elders for Climate Justice: Steve Simmer, Stu Kennedy, and Robert Ryan from Massachusetts. Lance Polya, who like me is from Northern Vermont. So any questions before we begin, Deb?
No, this is going to be fun.
Okay, I'm going to lead off with the first question and then pass it on to other people here for other questions. So it seems clear that we're not going to get much help on the climate change front from Washington, D.C. anytime soon. You've been in state government at many levels. For example, your involvement as Secretary of the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. So what ideas do you have for what states can or should be doing to most effectively address climate change? What are some of the major leverage points?
Well, thank you for that question. That's like the big one, right? The Trump administration's reversal of Obama-era climate policies was not unexpected, but it's still alarming. And I have to say, if we think back just to this past year, couldn't have come at the worst time, right? We've had the hottest year on record yet again. We've had terrible storms in the South, and Florida and Texas and Puerto Rico still recovering, all climate related. And to be a moment where, as one of the largest economies in the world, we're stepping back from our commitment to climate change, it's really terrible. It's unethical. It's immoral in my view. But that being said, the Trump era policies, these Trump policies were not unexpected. He campaigned on, getting out of the Paris Climate Accord. He campaigned on bringing back coal. We all have seen how it's harder to do than to say. And the other piece, and this gets to your question, is that the federal government is only one player. They only have control over, they do have some, they could be real leaders, but they don't cover the market on climate response. Really, a lot is left up to state and local governments, and a lot is left to the markets as well. So I'd like to talk about both of them. In answer to your question, though, about state and local leadership, it really matters. And that's because the rubber meets the road on the local level, literally. So transportation policy, some of it's driven by federal money, but a lot of that money gets implemented locally. So are communities building bike paths? Or are they investing in multimodal transportation opportunities, buses and bike lanes and different kinds of ride share services? Or are they just investing for single occupancy vehicles? I would say that's a thing of the past in most of our major cities and towns across the country, in part because it's just not tenable, but it's also bad policy. So let me start by saying state and local governments have really stepped up. And they stepped up before the Trump administration took over. and they're continuing to take leadership. Just today, actually, in the New York Times, you might have noticed Governor Hickenlooper from Colorado announcing that he was going to bring Colorado into the Clean Car Coalition that follows the California rules for what auto manufacturers are required to do in terms of clean car technology. It's California, 8 other states, Vermont is one of them, and Colorado is now joining, which is tremendous news. New Jersey and Pennsylvania are now talking to the regional greenhouse gas initiative states. Vermont's part of RGGI. That's a cap and trade program that reduces greenhouse gases from the energy sector. New states are talking about how can we get back in? How can we participate in this program? And even beyond that, over 30 states across the country have their own goals, their renewable energy and climate goals that they're following, and they're red states and blue states. They're not just, they're not just on the coast, they're not just the folks who voted for Hillary Clinton. It's across partisan lines. States are stepping up. So that's great. And they've got control. So some of them, as I'd mentioned, are joining cap and trade for the electric sector. The Western Climate Initiative includes all the sectors. So it's not just electricity, it's also heating fuels, it's also transportation fuels. They're just rolling that out slowly. So we'll see how that works. For now, it's looking good, but we'll see what it does to the economies there and what kind of success we can learn from the Western climate initiatives. When we think about addressing climate change, we're really thinking I'm thinking in 4 different pots, not 3 different pots, 4 different pots. One of them is thinking about electric. How do we get our electricity? How do we generate electricity? And those of you who are in Vermont know that we've had in the past some pretty robust goals. In fact, all of New England has shared similar goals. We're part of a regional group. Our governors get together in the Northeast, so it's New England states plus New York, talking about how can we share goals, since we're in, all of us are in ISO New England, and how do we share our experiences and create a market here. So with our electric sector, we have been providing incentives to deploy renewables. The new governor is stepping back from that some, which is of some concern, but I think our legislature here in Vermont is going to address that. Meanwhile, in Charlie Baker in Massachusetts is going gung-ho. And so those of you from Massachusetts should be pretty proud of your Republican governor taking climate change as a significant issue for his administration. So incentivizing renewable energy development, that is a state and local, it's in state and local purview. That's not really impacted federally. Tariffs, I mean, they can make it a little less cost effective if we're used to bringing in our solar panels from China. So it's not to say they don't have any effect, but the significant policy levers on the state and local level. So we've talked about transportation. How are we building out infrastructure? How are we making it possible for people to make good choices, climate safe choices with transportation? The electric sector in New England, home heating is really the big issue. We've got some of the oldest housing stock in the country, and that means it's inefficient. And so I think that is the nut yet to crack. It is a significant piece of our pie here in Vermont, and I would imagine also in our neighboring states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, as well. So those are 3 areas. The 4th, though, which is an area that we haven't really been spending a lot of time on as a matter of policy, but at the Gund Institute of Environment and in the Rubenstein School, we're spending a lot of time looking at it. And how do we engage our natural processes, right? What's coming from, what's our greenhouse gas footprint coming from our forests and our farms and our wetlands, and how do we manage our landscape to hold carbon rather than release carbon? And that's an area, actually internationally, that's part of a bigger conversation right now. So natural processes, heating, electric, and transportation. In Vermont, manufacturing is less of a big issue because we're not heavily industrial. In our more industrial neighbors, areas of neighbors, and looking at efficiency in industrial processes is also an issue. And let me say with RGGI, and I don't know if you want me to talk a little bit about RGGI and how it works.
I think we're kind of familiar with that.
Okay, so what RGGI does is as this regional greenhouse gas initiative auctions off essentially pollution credits, right? So you can only emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases based on how much you've purchased in this auction. The auction proceeds are then reinvested in the states for efficiency projects. And so in Vermont and across New England, or across the RGGI states, those reinvested proceeds have been used to help our industrial processes become more efficient and less emitting, as well as focused in Vermont, at least on home heating and creating greater efficiency in our housing stock.
Okay, well, thank you very much on that answer, Deb. It sounds very encouraging out there, so that's hopeful. I'm going to pass on the next question to Lance, who I think you already covered part of it, but Lance, why don't you take it from here?
Yes, Deb, thank you. When our fellow Vermont compatriot Bill McKibben founded 350.org just 10 years ago, 350 parts per million of atmospheric CO2 was considered the tipping point before irreversible damage from climate change could occur. Now we're having measurements of upwards of 411 parts per million, which is already 17% above the 350 level that McKibben said was safe, and the rate of increase is accelerating. Even the non-carbon energy alternatives being implemented don't seem to slow down this runaway atmospheric CO2 buildup. So Deb, my question to you is, do you honestly see any hope of relief from this doomsday scenario? If so, what specific policies seem to be the most effective? And conversely, Deb, what policies receive the most hype but are essentially ineffective for reducing atmospheric CO2? Thank you.
Well, I am an optimistic person, right? So I really truly believe there will remain, so long as there are people willing to work on this issue, and believe me, across the world, people are committed to working on this issue. I was both in Paris and then in Morocco following up on the Paris Climate Accord, and there is, with the exception of now of the United States heading our own way, hopefully for just the next couple more years, that the rest of the world is all on board on addressing the threats of climate change. It is true that there are natural processes that are just going to continue to happen because of the atmospheric carbon that exists today. But it's also true that the smartest minds in the world are working on this issue and are thinking about it. There's been a whole host of studies and symposium looking at, okay, what's the most impactful things we could be doing, and how do we, and I would suggest that the answer is not just one thing, it's an all-in answer. We've got to be doing everything all at once. And I have to say, 350.org plays a very important role keeping the pressure on, keeping this issue visible and on the top of people's minds. So I think that's great. I think there's a danger in saying, oh, it's too late, we're doomed, right? Because then that's a more permission for non-action. And I would say, when I was at Harvard, we talked about the different kinds of problems that leaders face. Some problems are just technical problems, like actually closing the ozone hole. That was a technical problem, right? Certain kind of pollution created an ozone hole, so you created some rules to end that kind of pollution, and it's done. And that was a technical problem because it didn't require significant changes, like it didn't impact me, right? So instead of spraying on deodorant, I roll on deodorant, right? It's not whatever, right? It's aerosol. So that was such a little piece of the collective lifestyle. The problem and the challenge with climate change is it's an adaptive challenge. It's not a technical challenge. There's lots of technical solutions, but for us to address climate change and reverse climate change, which I believe we can do, we have to adapt. We've got to live differently in our communities, with each other, on the planet. We need to think differently. And so that takes significant leadership. There is leadership. I would say having a Trump White House is a significant setback because leaders do matter. Even here in the United States, where the most recent survey shows 70% of the population agree that climate change is real, it's happening, and it's human cost, right? So it's significantly up from just a decade ago. It's shocking that there's 30% that aren't there, but we don't have to talk about that. So let me say the narrative of it's too late is an unhealthy narrative. So I think it's important to talk about optimism. In specific answer to your question about what's the most impactful thing we could be doing, and this comes out of Project Drawdown. I don't know if you're aware of Project Drawdown, but it's a collective effort among scientists to think about this question, like how do we prioritize? What's the most impactful ways of making a difference? And from Project Drawdown, really it's about population control. Ultimately, fewer people means less consumption, means a less climate change or less acceleration of climate change. So population control, hard to talk about, but really important. In Vermont, we're ahead of the game, which is a mixed bag, right? Because you want to have young people here, and I certainly want some babies in my family as my kids are getting that age. But yes, having fewer children, having children later. And what's interesting is the study showed that the single most important factor in how many children a woman will bear in her lifetime is education, whether she's educated. So I know this is unexpected, but the number one suggestion coming out of Project Drawdown is we educate girls. We invest in educating girls. We invest in family planning. That's really important. I would say that that some of the things that we do here in the United States, in Vermont, and progressive communities where, oh, let's buy an electric car. Well, that's great. We actually had an electric car. We've had an electric car, and I love my Leaf. But if you're buying something new that you didn't actually need, that's a problem, right? Because of its embedded carbon, right? And what it took. So consumerism. So the more we can shift away from consumerism and make more, reuse more, and buy less, that is going to be critical. So, and then the other piece is meat, how we eat is, how we grow food, how we transport food is another significant factor. Very hard to talk about. Both of those are poster child for these adaptive challenges, and it's an important conversation to have.
Thank you, Deb. As a fellow Vermonter, I can respect the thing on population growth. And Governor Scott's trying to get new people into the state. All right, I'll pass my question on to Robert Ryan.
Thank you, Lance. Deb. First, I'm impressed by your optimism. It helps me to, I think, if there's a continuum on this issue, from the optimistic to pessimistic, I have to admit to being more on the pessimistic side. So, and as you mentioned, Charlie Baker, maybe I should come out there, the Environmental League of Massachusetts just gave him a C for his leadership in this area. So not a ringing endorsement for those of us who would like to see him. And truth be told, as you know, you're involved in government. Our state house, we have the way it works. We have a progressive Senate. We have some very good ideas coming out, and we have the people with the real power, or the House of Representatives, and they're putting the kibosh on the kind of advances we like to see.
Yeah.
I guess that's a segue into my question, which is, I guess I pick up on Lance, and seeing that the temperature's going up, the 411 parts of carbon per million and so forth, and the urgency just seems so great, and the adaptation kind of things that you're saying seem like they're gonna, that's generational, that's 30, 40, 50 years. And how do we oppose the overwhelming influence of the people who like generating their power through fossil fuels? It seems that, for the last 30 years, our fossil fuel companies have waged, sadly, a very successful disinformation system, hiding the science. They buy elections, millions and millions of dollars to elect people, with our man Scott Pruitt, maybe Exhibit A. So the industries, the fossil fuel industries, utility industries are very, very happy with the status quo. It just seems that their influence is overwhelming in many ways to, quote, ordinary citizens and grassroots activists. From your perspective, again, you have a lot of experience in government. What can be used to try to counter the influence that these behemoths have around this issue?
So it sounds like there's really two questions. One is, how do we communicate about this issue in a way that really engages people and brings them in? And then the second is, how do we manage this in the political process? And so starting with the communication piece, one of there's out of Yale, there's a whole department that looks at climate communication and public opinion around climate change. And the findings that come from their work that I find really compelling is that we're not really listening anymore as a society. We just want to hear the stuff we already believe, right? We're not really open-minded to look at a different perspective. And in fact, with the way new media works, we really never have to. We never have to be exposed to any other opinion except for the ones we already hold. And certainly, what's a fact, right? Nobody's believing that facts are a thing anymore, or science, and that's a problem for science, and and scientific integrity and supporting scientific inquiry. So what they found that was interesting is that what we believe is more about our identity. What do we believe about ourselves? Oh, I'm a liberal, Northeastern, so of course I'm, a green sneaker, climate activist. Oh, I'm a Southern Baptist Christian conservative. Well, climate change, who knows? But really, I have a whole different set of beliefs and things I care about. So the way you begin to bring more people into the conversation is by shared identity. Finding those leaders who share an identity. So, for example, the Pope's encyclical was incredibly important. There are billions of Catholics all around the world who are influenced by the Catholic Church's now leadership on these issues, which is very important. So, who are the other leaders who could be the spokespeople for action? The other thing is there's a lot of what we have to do to become more climate smart and to reverse greenhouse gases. We can do just for lots of other good reasons. And so in my view at this point, unless you're a leader, when you should be talking about climate change, there's no shame in talking about all those other benefits, depending on who your audience is. So as a leader, we had a series of trainings actually that we brought to Vermont for the climate cabinet. We had all of the cabinet level officials met together once a quarter to talk about climate change and how it was impacting our agencies. And we brought in some training on communication. So when Chuck Ross, who was then the Secretary of Ag, was talking to farmers, he would talk about their bottom line. How do they run a business? And to think about whether or not it makes sense to bring in a digester, which is climate smart, right? It reduces greenhouse gases off the farm, but it also is another revenue generator. So looking for where there are those co-benefits and speaking from a place of where your audience is tremendously important. When it comes to the political, politics, it's really, again, getting people out to vote. It was the last election, in my view, was tragic. It was influenced by Russian meddling and the Russians being against Hillary Clinton. I think Comey, I blame him for making a really poor judgment about the emails, but the past is past. Let's now talk about what's coming up next and make sure that we're getting our voters out. The state house elections are very important because of gerrymandering. So it's at all levels that we need to be paying attention. We need to get good people in office too. We need to make sure that people are willing to step up and run, and that means supporting them.
Okay, thank you very much. Stu Kennedy has our next question.
Deb, you've already spoken about how to communicate effectively about climate change, and this is a follow-up question on that. You've worked a lot on communicating effectively with the goal of advancing action, getting people to move on climate change. What have you found in your experience is the most effective approach to getting people from their awareness and their concern and their worry about it, as we all are, to actually doing something? What is the best approach? And particularly we're interested in, as elders, how to speak with our demographic group and how to talk with other demographic groups, people of all ages, socioeconomic groups and genders and so forth.
So in answer to that, I've got two pieces of advice. One is that people relate best to storytelling. And so as you're talking to people to try to get them to act, you need to help them imagine what that action would be like and what would be, why it's a good thing. And so storytelling is really, really important. Understanding, starting where your audience is also important, as I said, in answer to the earlier question, but in doing so, doing it by telling stories. Numbers, statistics, not really important, right? The doom and gloom, about melting ice caps, not really helpful, actually. So it's a combination of telling stories that really inspire somebody to sort of that higher purpose or the action, and then making the actions actionable, right? So if the problem is so big, my turning off the lights in my house when I leave a room is such a little drop in the bucket. Why does that matter? We actually know that every little bit does add up, right? It all matters over time, and we got to start somewhere. So that might be part of the story. But making it easy and convenient for people to make the right choices. Not to say that the California's clean car standards is a great example of that, right? You're not going to buy an electric car when you need a new car if there aren't any choices of electric cars to buy, right? If you've never seen one, if you've never driven one, if there's not a place to charge, you're not going to make that choice. Weatherizing your house, you're not going to weatherize your house if first of all, if you don't have money to do it, and if the financing is too hard, or if it means that you've got to move all your furniture out of a room because they're tearing down walls. So how do we think about deploying solutions and making it easy for people to make the right choice? We had this conversation at the Agency of Natural Resources when we were talking about zero waste. Because in Vermont, actually, a significant chunk of greenhouse gases come off of our landfills. It comes from organics in the landfills. That as they break down, it gives off methane, which is a very highly polluting greenhouse gas. And so how do we get people to recycle organics or have more reuse, less actual food waste? And the concept, and not to mention recycle more. The concept there was, how do we make it just as convenient to compost, recycle as it is to throw something away? And so the new Vermont law, new as in now, it's probably 40 years old, requires that wherever there's a trash can in a public space, that there's right next to it a recycling bin. So it's just as convenient to recycle as it is to throw away. And in that, ultimately, that will include organics because that's a problem. And of course, recycling is in crisis right now because of China not buying our stuff, not buying our glass and plastic. So we are so there's stress and strain on the system right now. But ideally, by making it just as convenient to do the right thing, more people can make that choice, and then telling the stories so that people want to make the right choice.
Thank you for that answer. That's wonderful. I want to say, by the way, that I'm really eager to have my granddaughter, who's going to be a senior in high school and tells me that environmental science has been her favorite high school subject, to see this interview and to hear you talk. I'm sure she'll be amazed.
That's great.
Thank you. I'll pass it on now to Stephen Simmer for the next question.
Thank you, Stuart. Deb, I really appreciate some of the thoughts that you shared on adaptation. And my question is really kind of an elaboration of that. Communities around the world, whether it's in the islands or in Vermont, are under assault by the rapid acceleration of climate change. And I've heard that you've talked about building climate resilient communities, and that phrase really sticks in my head. I'm curious what you mean by a climate resilient community, and how do we get there? How do we build those?
And actually, now I'm talking beyond resilience to climate smart community, because we should be thinking about reducing greenhouse gases as well as protecting ourselves from the impacts of climate change. So one of the things we know right now is that climate change is here, it's happening, and it's having an immediate impact. In Vermont, of course, we had Tropical Storm Irene, but in addition, we've had dozens of other significant storm events that we've never had in the past. And it's because of the way the winds operate, it's because of the way the moisture is in the air, that in Vermont, our particular vulnerabilities are to flooding, as we saw with Tropical Storm Irene, episodic drought, because now we're getting more water, but it's kind of all at once, which means that in the in-between periods, we're having dry spells. Extreme heat, I remember the first car I bought here in Vermont, like I didn't have air conditioning in the car, because why would I need air conditioning? It's right, and we still don't have air conditioning in our house. We've got some fans that we use now much more than we ever did before. So extreme heat is a significant issue, and then invasive species and pests, and including Lyme's disease coming from ticks who just 8 years ago wouldn't have been able to winter over successfully in Vermont. So we've got to be prepared for these climate vulnerabilities. And so how do we begin to think about our communities and think about, in Vermont in particular, Massachusetts as well, we've got a lot of open nature. We've got a lot of, we can use the gifts of nature to help protect our communities. And there's a great story that I like telling to people out of state about Tropical Storm Irene, and it relates to Otter Creek. And the Otter Creek is actually the longest river in Vermont, and it's flowing north like our rivers do. And so during Tropical Storm Irene, there was tremendous flooding that wiped out the town of Brandon, just wiped out downtown. It just became a gully, with rushing water. And as that water continued to go north and more water was coming into the system, you would have expected that Middlebury would have been wiped out as well. There's a bridge going over the Otter Creek. It's right in the middle of downtown. You would have expected tens of millions of dollars of damage to Middlebury, but that didn't happen. And so we were really curious about, why? And we discovered that between Brandon and Middlebury, there had been some investments in conservation. Now, it was because it's part of the fly zone, and it's a great set of wetlands for the snow geese and for a bunch of other species. But there was a very large stretch of bogland and wetland that had been conserved. So what happened is, as the water's rushing up north with more water coming into the system, it gets to these bogs and dissipates. And so by the time it got to Middlebury, it was still flooding, but it wasn't destroying. And so that's a really interesting lesson. So when we think in Vermont of our flood risk, how do we mimic that in other places? And so some of the work we've done here in Vermont that I think is pretty unique is working with our land trust partners. So all of the land conservation organizations, working with some environmental engineers. We put together some tools that allowed us to identify areas most at risk, looking at how the water runs off the landscape. In Vermont, our challenge is we've got these steep mountains with these narrow valleys. And so, as you can imagine, the water comes rushing down and it doesn't have enough places to dissipate. Like other places, our other challenge is that over the years, we have channelized our rivers and straightened them. So that allows the water to go faster as well. So our goal is twofold. One is to identify areas that could serve as flood storage to prevent this kind of destructive damage, and wherever possible, to allow our rivers to reconnect to their floodplains. Because in a natural system, you've got shallow, wide rivers that are kind of have a gentle meander, and so when there's a flood, it lifts into the floodplain, which then gets the benefit of all the nutrients in the water, and it doesn't destroy. So as we're thinking about our communities, we're thinking about flood. How do we use nature to help us save ourselves from flood? Because one of the things we do know is just hardening ourselves, building more walls and things, that works a little bit for a little time, and then you just got to build it again. There's an old religious song about that. I don't know if you build your house upon, it's like you got to build again. And so then when we think about other things like invasives, we have to have a whole series of plans and ways to address it. When we think about extreme heat, Vermont is one of the states who has a health department project. There's a human services grant, health and human services grant, to look at climate change and climate impacts. And so really thinking about, we need cooling shelters. We need to start thinking about what do we need in our communities to protect ourselves from climate change. The other thing that we did post-Irene is we got some grant money from the EPA to think about economic resilience. So Vermont, our economy relies on tourism. It relies on winter sports. It relies on summer sports. It relies on people being able to get here to visit. It relies on an agricultural sector. And so where are the vulnerabilities in those sectors? And what can we do now to shore ourselves up so that we're ready for the changes that are coming?
Thank you, Deb. That's very interesting. I appreciate the answer. I'm going to turn us back over to our moderator, Judd Laurie. Judd?
So we've gone a little past our allotted time here, Deb, but I greatly appreciate you spending some time with us, and especially for sharing your experience and expertise in regard to how we can get about addressing a way to mitigate this rapidly escalating problem of climate change. So any last words you want to leave with us before we kind of close this out?
Well, just thank you so much for having me, and it sounds like a great project, and I wish you all the best of luck.